When we think of retro Nintendo series, like some of the first they ever made for the Famicom, I reckon most fans think of Super Mario Bros., Duck Hunt, Balloon Fight, Ice Climber, and so on. These more action-heavy titles. But really, when Nintendo started their home console journey, a big focus for their development teams was to create titles based on already existing, recognisable games. This includes popular arcade games like Donkey Kong and Pinball, as well as classic tabletop games like Mahjong. And this also included sports games. Turning real-life sports into video games is one of the oldest go-tos for developers. Heck, Pong is just a very basic form of tennis, really. So it's no surprise Nintendo would do the same, and in their quest to do this, they tackled almost every type of sport out there. They made a tennis game of their own, a baseball game, a soccer game, volleyball, ice hockey, and more unconventional sports like wrestling and motocross racing. But one sport stood out above the rest, and that is golf. Not only is it the best-selling of Nintendo's traditional sports games, it's also the only one to consistently get new entries up until the present day. In fact, I counted 18 cases of Nintendo-owned golfing games, and well, when I saw that number, I just knew I would be a fool to not talk about them. But I don't want to talk about that topic while sitting here in my room. I want to capture all of your attention by immersing you in the spirit of golf. I have an idea. Be right back. Here I am, out on the green, ready to play some golf myself, while I teach you all about the history of Nintendo's golf. And where is the obvious best place to start? On hole 1, of course. So, in order to go back to the beginning, we need to think about how golf was perceived in Nintendo's home country of Japan. So in Japan, golf is a very popular sport amongst businessmen. Particularly in the 70s and 80s, where being a salaryman was kind of seen as the default pathway for a lot of Japanese people growing up. And Nintendo, with their brand new piece of hardware just about to hit the market, was really keen on getting some recognizable games onto the system. And golf was one of those titles. They thought it would hit a different demographic from games like Donkey Kong. And so they began pitching out and planning to have golf as a launch year title for the system. But there was a problem, and that was that Nintendo themselves were too occupied with the hardware and all the other games they had to make to actually be able to develop golf themselves. So they began pitching it out. They tried to see who could develop this golf game for them, and unfortunately, most of the companies they spoke to said no, because to them, they thought it was impossible to put a whole 18 holes of golf, onto a single Famicom cartridge. That was, except for one man, Satoru Iwata from HAL Laboratory. At the time, he had just finished working on pinball for the NES, and when he was approached by his colleagues and told that Nintendo was shopping around golf, he jumped on the chance. He saw it as a challenge, something that only he could do. Iwata looks back at golf as a crowning achievement of sorts. It was a game that took him quite a while to finish, and not just because he was the sole programmer for the game. Video games were so early in their lifespan at this point that data compression wasn't really a thing. In order to fit 18 holes onto the cartridge, Iwata had to program an entirely original data compression routine from scratch, which he did basically through trial and error. But he succeeded, and golf came into being. Like many games at the time, the dev team for Golf was in the single digits, with a single person in charge of each aspect of the game, but Golf had a fairly star-studded team. Kenji Miki was the director and course designer, having previously worked on baseball and pinball for Nintendo. Masayuki Umera was producer for the game, having produced pretty much the majority of Nintendo's early Famicom titles from all the sports games and all the Donkey Kong games, and titles like Mahjong and Pinball. Koji Kondo, who basically every Nintendo fan knows at this point, made his Famicom debut here, with Golf being his second ever title, following the arcade version of Punch-Out that released a few months prior. And lastly, the character designer and game designer, which includes coming up with the power and accuracy bar for swinging the club that would go on to be used in basically every golf game ever, was Shigeru Miyamoto. Miyamoto handled the game design and character design for Golf, along with tennis and baseball, the other sports games made by Nintendo at this time. This is probably why Osan, the title character, looks so much like Mario. In fact, if you lived outside of Japan, you'd probably assume this was Mario, but that's not actually the case. Nintendo Power did refer to this golfer as Mario in its gameplay guidebook and other supplementary material, but in Japan, Golf is not considered a part of the Mario Golf series, and its protagonist, Osan, would show up in Captain Rainbow on the Wii, proving he was a different character entirely. Sources for when Golf turned into Mario Golf are hotly debated, but Nintendo has given us a stance on this, and I'll mention that when we get to it shortly. For now, just know that this is not Mario. This is Osan. Golf was released on May 1st, 1984, and was reviewed very positively. Sales were numbered at over 4 million copies worldwide, with Japan alone yielding 2.46 million. Because of this, Golf is the best-selling sports game for the NES, and the 10th best-selling game on the system overall. Golf would go on to be a launch title for the NES in America and Europe, and would get ported to the Famicom Disk System and Nintendo Player Choice 10 arcade cabinets in 1986. It was released on both the 3DS and Wii U Virtual Console in 2011 and 2013 respectively. A version of Golf was actually hidden on the Switch's BIOS, and had motion controls added to it using the Joy-Con. This was an obvious homage to the late Satoru Iwata, who had passed away suddenly a few years prior to the Switch's launch. Activating it required the internal system clock to be set to July 11th, Satoru Iwata's death anniversary, and performing his iconic directly to you hand gesture with both Joy-Con controllers on the home menu. If successful, a voice clip of Iwata from a Japanese 2012 presentation would confirm the input, and an emulator of Golf with added motion control support would promptly boot up. It was unfortunately patched out in a firmware update. Golf also had some interesting ports to additional systems. It was one of the many Famicom and NES games included in the original Animal Crossing, both on Nintendo 64 and GameCube. The GameCube version even allowed you to use the GBA link cable in order to play 2-player, making the game playable on the Game Boy Advance. Not that it needed Animal Crossing to do that, because Golf was included as one of the many e-reader games, where scanning 5 cards would produce Golf on the GBA. Lastly, Golf was one of those rare Nintendo titles that was released for non-Nintendo systems back in the day. After its Famicom release, Hudson Soft ported Golf to the Japan-only PC-88 and Sharp X1 in 1985. It was also one of the games included in NES Remix. Even though Nintendo had moved into the home console market, they were still an arcade developer, and in 1984 they released their Nintendo Versus system of arcade machines. These were designed to bring Famicom games and put them in the arcade as an extra form of marketing, and one of the games they decided to do this for was Golf. Now, people will argue that the Versus arcade machines are nothing more than simple ports of the NES games and shouldn't count as their own category, but I disagree on this. Some of these Versus versions of games were very different, to the point that they were later re-released as their own separate sequels, like Versus Excitebike for example. Golf didn't get a re-release, but I think its Versus version was different enough that I would count it as a unique game. For starters, there was a point system added into it, like many arcade games had. And then they bumped the number of holes from 18 to 26, with only 17 of those holes being returning. And most importantly, in my opinion, is that the version they released in Japan and the version they released internationally were very different. The version they released internationally was called Stroke and Match Golf, and that was actually split into two different games, Versus Golf and Versus Ladies Golf. Versus Golf International Edition is more in line with the original NES version of the game than what Japan saw. It still has more holes, numbering 21 rather than 26, but these holes haven't been made harder like they were in Japan. The extra 3 holes all come from the Japanese version of Versus Golf, and then the remaining 18 are just the same as they were on the NES. This is probably why many see this game as just a port. But Versus Ladies Golf is different. Released 2 months after Versus Golf, Ladies Golf has its own 21 courses, some of which come from the Japan version of Versus Golf, but many of which are brand new and exclusive to this game. As the name implies, the main characters are also changed to be ladies instead of men. One could argue that if Osan is Mario, then Lady here is Pauline, given that's what her original name was. Versus Ladies Golf was never released in Japan, so there's no original source to argue against this, like with the Osan and Mario connections. Although if we're following the Japan naming scheme, I guess her name would be Oba-san? Versus Golf released in Japan in August 1984, 3 months after its Famicom release, and launched in October later that year for America. It also came to Nintendo Switch in 2019 via the Arcade Archives. Specifically, the international version of Versus Golf, not the original Japanese version, nor the original Ladies Golf, neither of which have ever seen a re-release. This probably isn't that surprising though, given that Versus Golf wasn't that popular, especially Versus Ladies Golf, which wasn't in arcades for very long. So Versus Golf wasn't a big success, but Golf on the Famicom was, and so that meant it needed a proper sequel. In 1986, Golf was re-released for the Famicom Disk System, and then in 1987, it got not 1, but 2 sequels released, Japan Course and US Course. These 2 games were created in conjunction with one another, which is why I'm pairing them here and sharing them all as just Whole 3. Now, Japan Course was the first to release, coming out in July of 1987, and it improved on the formula that Satoru Iwata and HAL Laboratory had started. For starters, there was now a distinction between the fairway and the rough. And also, trees were a lot more of a solid obstacle rather than just being an indicator for out of bounds. Height was added to terrain, and the player could now aim, rather than automatically facing the green. The US course took all of these improvements and then refined them even further. Interestingly, despite the names, neither Japan course nor the US course are based on any real-life golf courses. In fact, you probably wouldn't know the Japan course was even meant to be in Japan if it wasn't for the name and title screen. US course, however? All rise and salute the American flag! Yep, this is the title where Mario's famous American flag outfit comes from, something that would show up in Super Smash Bros., Super Mario Odyssey, Mario Kart Tour, and future Mario Golf games. And yes, this time it really is Mario, and Japan Course even has Luigi, and the forgotten third brother, Comp 1. Oh, when will Comp 1 return? Probably at the same time that Bowser's brother re-enters the spotlight. While America would attempt to argue that Mario was always the star of Nintendo's golf series, Golf Japan Course and Golf US Course was his real debut as a golfer. And now that we are here, I can show you how I know this. Why I know that Nintendo of America is wrong for claiming that Mario was the star of the original. In Japan, there is an official Mario website where fans can learn about the series and its characters. Most importantly for us now, the website has a history page that lists when every Mario game comes out, and you can separate it into Mario sub-series as well, which is really neat. Honestly, this website deserves its own mini video at some point. Maybe a Nintendrix Talks? Anyway, if you have a look at specifically the Mario Golf line of games, according to Nintendo themselves, it doesn't start at Mario Golf on the 64 like many wikis will claim, and it doesn't start at Golf on the NES like Nintendo of America would claim. It starts here at Golf Japan Course. This is the first entry in the Mario Golf sub-series, and for at least until the GBA and GameCube come along, we're going to see Nintendo ping-pong back and forth between the Mario Golf series and its generic Nintendo Golf series of games. Golf Japan Course gives us Mario in his usual attire, Luigi as Player 2 sporting a colour scheme more reminiscent of his sprite in Super Mario Bros., and Peach makes a cameo on the cover art. As for Golf US Course, Mario now sports his popular American flag outfit, although interesting, Luigi has been scrubbed from the game entirely. I guess he couldn't get a US visa in time. Now when players compete against each other, they all take the form of Mario, just with different coloured stars and stripes. That is unless they've managed to unlock the secret second character, Lady. Is this the same Lady from Versus Ladies Golf? Or now that the series is officially a Mario Golf game, is this meant to be Pauline? After all, her name at the time was just Lady. It doesn't really look like Peach, but it also doesn't look exactly like Pauline either. The unlock criteria for Lady is rather interesting. See, both Japan and US course come on a special blue disc rather than the standard yellow, and this allowed players to insert it into a machine called the Disc Fax, a public machine found in stores across Japan that would send the data from the game directly to Nintendo. Inserting that disc into the machine just once is what would unlock Lady in the game. Nintendo used the information it received from players to run nationwide tournaments, complete with prizes for the best scoring players, which included real trophies, a gold version of Punch-Out! For some reason, and relevant to this video, alternative versions of both Japan and US course that came with more brand new challenging holes known as the Professional and Champions course. Only 100 copies of Champions course were ever made, making it one of the rarest Nintendo games out there. Neither game would release outside of Japan, likely due to Nintendo of America choosing not to bring the Famicom disk system over, but the new gameplay additions wouldn't remain locked to Japan for very long. By 1989, the Famicom had been out for 6 years, and Nintendo was looking forward to their new piece of hardware, the Super Famicom. But there wasn't going to be any golf games for the Super Famicom. Instead, what Nintendo chose to do was stick to its 8-bit machines and release a golf game for its new, portable piece of hardware. See, by 1989, the Game & Watch had been out for nearly a decade, and so Nintendo was about to release a brand new handheld system, a successor to it. An 8-bit machine that they were sort of marketing as the Famicom you could take on the go. Because of this, the Game Boy had a lot of titles that were very reminiscent of early Famicom titles. There was an 8-bit Mario platformer, a Mahjong game, ports of their various arcade titles, and ports of their sports games. Game Boy saw baseball, it saw tennis, and of course, it saw golf. Golf launched in Japan on November 28, 1989, 7 months after the Game Boy was placed on the market, and it sold phenomenally, pushing over 2 million units worldwide and ending up as the best-selling sports game on the platform. Despite this, it's only ever been released once, on the 3DS Virtual Console in 2011. The game is still not on NSO despite a later golf game from the Game Boy's library already making it onto the service. Now, if you were to look up golf on the Game Boy on Wikipedia or any fan wikis, you'll likely see the claim that the game is a simple port of the NES one. But as someone who has actually played all of these golf games for this video, that is just not true. Game Boy Golf is its own game with more courses than the NES title, all of which are unique to this game, as unique as golf courses can be anyway. Even mechanically, Golf on the Game Boy takes many of the changes found in the Japan and US course games, like a differentiation between the fairway and rough or making trees solid objects. No one would claim that Super Mario Land is a port of Super Mario Bros., and I think these two golf games are just as different from each other as those two. Honestly, I think the only reason some fans see this game as a simple port is because its name is simply Golf, and because it went backwards from the last two games by dropping Mario and friends from it, despite what Nintendo internationally would have you think. Yes, just like with Golf on the NES, Nintendo's international markets decided to slap Mario onto the marketing material for this game, even going as far as to put him front and center on the box. This is not the case in Japan, which just used original human golfers. As such, Golf is not a part of the Mario Golf series, and this is reflected once again on Nintendo's official website. At this point, Nintendo is fine with allowing separate yet almost identical golf franchises to exist, and we'll see this continue as we jump back to Mario Golf with our next and final 8-bit golf title. So despite the fact that Nintendo had a successor released at this point, they were still actually making Famicom games. Some of these titles were ones that were on the Famicom Disk System originally and just brought over, like The Legend of Zelda. Some were cross-platform releases with the Famicom and the Super Nintendo or the Game Boy, like Yoshi's Cookie and Dr. Mario. And then there were titles that were Japan exclusive, like Joy Mech Fight. But a handful of small NES titles were just Famicom and NES exclusive, despite the fact they were released after 1990. And our next game, and probably the most remembered 8-bit golf game, was one of them. NES Open Tournament Golf, or Mario Open Golf as it was known in Japan. As you might have guessed from that title, that makes this the first golf game that fully embraced the Mario series. Both Mario and Luigi were back as playable characters, and joining them as NPCs you had Peach, Daisy, Toad, and Donkey Kong.
Okay.
And funnily enough, Nintendo of America, despite all of their pushing to try and have Mario be the main character of these golf games, even when he's not even in them, this one time where the game was actually called Mario Golf, they changed the name. Absolutely wild stuff. This was actually Daisy's second ever appearance after her debut in Super Mario Land. There are still some generic human characters for Mario and Luigi to play against though, and these ones are even named with unique designs. This title would be the last golf game made by HAL Laboratory, and the last one with Satoru Iwata as programmer, and it is by far the culmination of everything they had learned over the last 7 years. It's easily the best 8-bit golf game, and it's also Nintendo's go-to for re-releases. So far, NES Open Tournament Golf has seen a release on the Famicom and NES in 1991, arcades in 1992, Wii Virtual Console in 2007 as a 3DS Ambassador game in 2011, and then released publicly in 2012, Wii U Virtual Console in 2014, Nintendo NES Mini in 2016, and Nintendo Switch Online in 2018. It was also planned to appear as one of the collectible NES games for Animal Crossing on the GameCube, but was cut. It's truly Nintendo's favourite classic golfing title. The most interesting part about NES Open Tournament Golf isn't its legacy as the most re-released golf game from Nintendo, however. It's that the NES and Famicom versions of the game are wildly different in terms of content and difficulty. In terms of gameplay, they are the same game, but Mario Open Golf is significantly harder than its NES counterpart, containing 5 playable courses as opposed to the International's 3. These courses are also quite different, with the few that did appear in both games having less obstacles, like trees and water, in the International version. So for golf game enthusiasts, you'll probably want to play through both versions. Luckily, it's easy to play Japanese games in the West and vice versa thanks to NSO. So if you never knew this fact, why not boot up your opposite region and give it a try? It's basically an expansion pass. Just do it after this video is done. In 40 minutes or so from now. Jesus, why did I make it so long? And with this, 8-bit golfing is over and done with. But on the next course, we will be jumping an entire 56 bits as we look at the title that truly popularised Nintendo's golf games worldwide, and one that is a personal favourite of mine. So by 1999, golfing games were a lot more commonplace. Competitors to Nintendo had hit the market like TNE Soft's True Classic Golf series and EA Games' PGA Tour. It's probably why Nintendo decided that they didn't need to do golf games anymore. So for the entirety of the Super Nintendo's life cycle, there just wasn't any golf games by them. They were all third-party competitors. At least in Japan. In America, Nintendo had worked with T&E Soft to bring a couple of extra golf games along. There was Golf on the Virtual Boy, and Wahale Golf, I actually don't know how to pronounce this one. Post-edit Josh will have it appear on screen. But by the end of the 90s, Nintendo decided that they wanted to throw Mario's cap back into the golfing course and get a new game out there. Well, actually, that's not quite true. Nintendo didn't make this decision. Instead, this is a decision made by a company that we're going to be hearing a lot of from for the rest of this video. And that company is Camelot! To properly discuss the development of Mario Golf, we have to briefly touch upon another big golfing series, Everybody's Golf on the PlayStation. Camelot Software Planning was founded in 1994 by the Takahashi brothers, who had made a name for themselves working with Sega to produce a series of RPGs called Shining Force across various Sega consoles. It was one of Sega's leading RPG franchises, but in 1994 the PlayStation was released and the two brothers decided to create their own studio with a focus on making PlayStation titles. Their first game, Beyond the Beyond, covered familiar territory for the brothers, being a turn-based RPG, and is notable as being the first PlayStation turn-based RPG released in the West, debuting before Final Fantasy VII. But after this, the brothers wanted to make something completely different. As they both loved playing golf and had actually grown up playing Japan course golf on the Famicom Disk System, they decided to work with Sony and kickstart the Everybody's Golf series in 1997. It helped that on their team they had Masashi Muramori, the developer of the World Golf series on PC, who would go on to create Clap Hands, the company that would take over the Everybody Golf series after the first title. The brothers were heavily inspired by Nintendo's previous golfing games, but also made enough additions themselves and tweaks to the game in order to make it a better experience overall, and in the process helped to define the way golf games would play for the industry going forward. Moving over to Nintendo at the time, they were facing a big issue with the Nintendo 64. Nintendo were well known for being the home of RPGs, on the Famicom and Super Famicom, but with the jump to 3D, many of the big RPG developers like Square and Enix abandoned Nintendo and moved over to Sony in order to take advantage of the CD format, which allowed for more storage space. This left the Nintendo 64 with a big RPG drought. The RPG genre was massive in Japan, and it wouldn't be until 1998 with the release of Quest 64 that Nintendo would actually get its first big RPG release. And well, Quest 64 isn't exactly remembered for being a milestone title. So, in the first half of the Nintendo 64's life, Nintendo was arranging meetings with various developers in an attempt to court some exclusive RPGs for the platform, and one of these developers was Camelot. The Takahashi brothers were pretty keen to work with Nintendo, and agreed to make a title for them. But they had their concerns. RPGs take a lot of time to make, and the Nintendo 64 was known for being notoriously difficult to develop for, another reason why many devs jumped ship to the PlayStation. The two were worried that, by the time they figured out how to develop for the platform, it would be too late to make an RPG for it that would actually be a success. Nintendo also shared this fear. They had reached out to Camelot based on their development history, but as this was the first time the two had worked together, Nintendo were unsure of Camelot's development capabilities. And so, as a way of demonstrating their capabilities to Nintendo, as well as a way of getting some practice with Nintendo 64 development, the team at Camelot pulled their knowledge from Everybody's Golf and created Golf 64, a prototype golf game. And Nintendo loved it so much that they asked Camelot to expand on the concept and create a new entry in the Mario Golf series. The core thesis of this game was to develop a title that could recreate the feeling of playing golf at a professional level. To do this, the brothers interviewed real-life professional golf course designers Robert Trent Jones Jr., Jack Nicklaus, and Perry Dye on the fundamentals of course design, especially on the distinct differences between public courses and members courses. I'm not going to go into the full details of golf course design in this video. That's probably too much technical golfing information for you all, but for those who are interested, I'll link the interview in my sources below. The results of all of this research led to the team creating courses that would ease the player into playing as a pro. The team also added weather effects to the game, a first for Nintendo's golf, which was done to add a feeling of unpredictableness, variation, and greater joy of golf to the game. Another first for Nintendo's golf were the addition of side modes, such as ring shot and mini golf. These were included as a way of training the player's golf skills, putting the player in unique scenarios that the developers hoped would improve their skill in the main game. Mario Golf released in June of 1999 in Japan, and was very well received, selling a total of 1.47 million copies worldwide. The game would go on to be re-released in every retro service from Nintendo, launching on the Wii in 2008, Wii U in 2015, and Nintendo Switch in 2022. For many players, this was their first Mario Golf game, and may have even been their first experience with golf in general, and it paved the way forward for the future of Nintendo's golfing outings for the next 2 decades. Well, this and their next golf title that was released just 2 months later.
Nice shot.
Nice on!
So by 1999, the Nintendo 64 was kind of floundering in the face of the PlayStation, but on the handheld market, the Game Boy had no competition. It was rock solid. Yet surprisingly, there were very few golf games for the Game Boy. There was Nintendo's original Golf and then like 2 others, and that was it. Well, why not change that, I guess, and with Camelot already making a Mario Golf game on the Nintendo 64, they should just make one for the Game Boy as well. And you see, remember, Camelot were brought on to make an RPG, and Mario Golf didn't exactly fit that description. They still had an RPG role to fulfill. But it didn't make much sense for them to work on 2 separate games at the same time like this. And so, you know what? When they say RPG, they don't necessarily mean role-playing game. They could mean role-playing golf instead. So the idea was put forward to have this Game Boy game serve as a companion piece, adding the elements of RPGs into the golf simulation genre to create something that hadn't really been seen up to this point. The development of Mario Golf on the Game Boy Color and Mario Golf on the Nintendo 64 happened hand in hand, but unlike the Japan course and US course from the Famicom days, these 2 games are very different, and so deserve to be treated separately, even though development of one greatly affected the other. For example, Mario Golf 64 had no characters that could hit the ball extremely high, straight, and far, and the reason for this is because it was really difficult to show this on the Game Boy. This may have also influenced the continued use of generic human characters in Mario Golf. Previous golf games had humans, but Mario Golf 64 greatly increased the number of playable Mario characters to the series, adding in monster characters like Yoshi, Donkey Kong, and Bowser. But if the player was to train their own golfer on the Game Boy to use in the 64 game, it might stand out as the only non-Mario character. Plus, Camelot needed a lot of opponents for players to face off against, and human characters were far easier to animate for than the wild proportions of some of Mario's friends, an issue that the team would face in future Mario Golf games. However, the biggest impact this co-development structure had was on the focus of Mario Golf Game Boy. Remember, the point of Mario Golf 64 was to make players feel like a professional, but that game was mostly gameplay and multiplayer focused. It put players in specific scenarios to train them, but did little to actually explain the finer details of golf to the player. That's where the Game Boy came into play. The Game Boy, as a handheld, was seen as more of a single-player system, and the game's focus on an RPG story mode reflected this. As players trained up their character throughout the game, they would be given mini-games that taught the player skills like what golf clubs were the best for each scenario, how to accurately perform an approach, and the best way to get out from behind a tree. It spent more time on teaching the player the play-by-play parts of golf, as the devs only had to worry about a single player's time. Mario Golf GB also kept track of each individual character's best scores for each tournament, something not available on the Nintendo 64. This was done so players knew where to focus their training, and also as a way to brag to friends on the schoolyard. Mario Golf for the Game Boy Color released in August of 1999 in Japan, just 2 months after the bigger Nintendo 64 release. It was then re-released on the 3DS Virtual Console in 2012, and finally Nintendo Switch Online in March of 2024. Following its initial release, Camelot would turn its attention towards Mario Tennis. But they would release one more golf game for Nintendo's premier handheld. This next entry is for sure the most obscure golf game made by Nintendo. Released after both Mario Golf on the 64 and the Game Boy, and after the Game Boy Advance had already released. And this was Mobile Golf, a version of golf made by Camelot that had online capabilities by connecting your Game Boy to your mobile phone, using the Mobile GB adapter. It was only released in Japan and has never seen a re-release, and was the final entry in Nintendo's generic golf franchise. In 1999, Nintendo and Konami teamed up to create Mobile 21, a company dedicated towards developing Game Boy and Game Boy Advance features which could connect to the internet through the use of Japanese mobile phones. This led to the release of the Mobile GB adapter in April 2000, and the service lasted until December 2002. There were a handful of games released that utilised this feature, most notably Pokemon Crystal and Mario Kart Super Circuit, but there was one game that Nintendo published that was specifically designed for use with this adapter, and that is Mobile Golf. Remember back in the Famicom days with Japan and US Open Course? Nintendo was holding nationwide tournaments where players had to upload their save files at kiosks across the country, and even though the market had long since moved past that point, Nintendo was still holding tournaments for their golf games, and offering prizes to winners. Mario Golf 64 even had tournaments, as documented on its Japanese website. Unlike in the past, these tournaments required players to upload their scores themselves, and could only take place on specific cups with specific rules that were programmed into the game ahead of release. It was a bit more tedious and limited than before, but with the mobile adapter, Nintendo could host tournaments via the internet, and have scores from players directly. They could also reward players with downloadable content exclusive to participation, unlike in the past where they had to send over entirely new cartridges to players. And that was the focus of Mobile Golf. The game played just like Mario Golf on the Game Boy. It even asked the player to make their own character, but the story mode was gone. In its place was the online tournament mode, which housed the majority of the unlockables, from new courses to characters to even new golf clubs. But don't think the game is empty without a story mode. Oh no, because Mobile Golf adds the majority of the minigames found in Mario Golf on Nintendo 64, like Ring Shot and Mini Golf. There are also more courses than in Mario Golf, with short courses and mini golf courses padding out the amount of golf one can play. Golf training was also expanded with an in-depth golfing glossary for players to reference at any point. Even though it was made by Camelot and it's clearly based on the Mario Golf engine, the game isn't considered a Mario Golf game. This is because in its base form, there is no Mario content in the game. The player picks between one of 4 playable characters, and all the opponents in the game are other generic humans, with 4 of them returning from Mario Golf, such as Kid, the male protagonist of that game. With that said, the game wouldn't end without Mario content added to it. By competing in tournaments online, players could unlock 4 more playable characters, all from the Mario universe, these being Mario, Peach, Yoshi, and Foreman Spike. This would also be Foreman Spike's last appearance as well, until the Super Mario Bros. Movie in 2023. Hopefully we're not waiting another 22 years until his next appearance. After the critical and commercial success of Mario Golf 64, the Takahashi brothers were absolutely thrilled, and they began to immediately work on tennis equivalents for both systems. But that happiness wouldn't last very long. For you see, Takahashi Hiroyuki, while out shopping one day, saw a bunch of kids trying out Mario Golf 64 on a demo kiosk. And he was really upset as he found out that the kids really struggled to figure out how to play the game. And I mean, I don't blame them. I wouldn't know how to play with one of these things either without years of experience. And that wasn't right. The focus, Mario's core demographic is children and families, and yet they were the ones struggling to play, and that does kind of show, as reports find that a lot of the demographic for Mario Golf 64 were middle-aged men. And no, that doesn't sit well with them at all. So they wanted to rectify this in a sequel on the GameCube. They wanted to make a Mario Golf game that appealed to all ages, and specifically families. And that brings us to Mario Golf Toadstool Tour, or as it was known in Japan, Mario Golf Family Tour. Yeah, they're really not subtle with that name, are they? The game's visuals also tried to strike a balance between feeling like a Mario game while also feeling like a golf game. The previous games definitely felt more like generic golf games with Mario characters included, as had been the style established by HAL Labs on the NES. This time around, they wanted to add more visual elements that felt distinctly more Mario, without going too overboard. To do this, all of the generic human characters were cut, and the team incorporated more Mario characters to compensate. Looking at Mario Tennis, Super Mario Sunshine, and Donkey Kong Country for reference. This is also why the characters were given power shots, a more fantasy-like super hit that fit the Mario aesthetic. Nintendo also provided input to the developers in order to make the game feel more Mario-like. The colour of the greenery, the sky, and the water were all done to match the general Mario aesthetic Nintendo had been building up to in that era, what would go on to be called the New Super Mario Bros. Style by fans in the future. And I do mean this style specifically, even though New Super Mario Bros. Hadn't been released yet. Originally, Toadstool Tour's water effects were going to be more in line with Super Mario Sunshine, as it was the latest game at the time, and Nintendo rejected the idea, because Super Mario Sunshine's visual style was not the typical Mario style they had in mind. Another thing Nintendo wanted from Camelot was to put an emphasis on the wind. They wanted players to be able to feel the wind while playing, which took some work to implement. The courses were also made more Mario-like, with more iconic Mario imagery added, like Princess Peach's castle. But the dev team did want to hold themselves back from going too crazy in this regard. They worried that if every course had the crazy Mario vibes, it would turn away players just here for the golf gameplay. So they strived to strike a balance in the course design, with early stages being more standard, and then later courses adding in wilder and wackier hazards. The last big addition was... They said the last big addition was to use sound to make the game... Will you stop that? This is the last big addition. The team felt that the silence you often see in real golf was boring for a video game, especially one with a multiplayer vibe, and Takahashi Shugo personally found just staring at the ball and waiting for your opponent to play to be boring. So they added in heckling so other players had something to do while they waited. It enhances communication, as they put it. But to me, it enhances frustration while I'm trying to putt. Ah, damn it! Anyway, Toadstool Tour released for the GameCube in 2003 and is treated by many fans as the best golf game Nintendo has ever made. A cult classic that is yet to be topped in the eyes of many. And just like its predecessor, it wasn't released on its own. So with both Mario Golf and Mario Tennis on the Nintendo 64, they saw a Game Boy companion piece that launched just alongside it, and was developed at the same time. And that formula turned out to be a huge success, and so it was only natural that when making Mario Golf for the GameCube, Camelot and Nintendo would want to replicate that original success. And so a Game Boy Advance Mario Golf game also began development along with the GameCube one. However, unlike Mario Golf GB, Mario Golf Advance Tour wasn't a simultaneous development with Mario Golf Toadstool Tour, at least not like the entire way through. We know they had to have some kind of crossover because there's Mario Golf Advance Tour characters in Mario Golf Toadstool Tour. But the point I'm getting at here is that unlike Mario Golf GB and Mario Golf 64, where they influenced each other's development, Mario Golf Advance Tour was influenced by Toadstool Tour and not the other way around. Because really, Advance Tour was made because Camelot had experience with the GBA and could pump it out really quickly. Which is good for me, because it means that this is going to be a par 3 instead of a par 5. One of the big differences between this game and Toadstool Tour was the return of the game's story mode and RPG elements, which also incentivized the return of all the generic human characters that were cut from Toadstool Tour. Advance Tour is set up as a direct sequel to Mario Golf on the Game Boy, with many of that game's original characters returning and all aged up. This really brings into question the timeline, as Kid is clearly no longer a kid in Advance Tour, and in fact the player is his apprentice, but Mario and friends don't look like they've aged a day. This is probably why Baby Mario didn't return. Unless this is Baby Mario. Advance Tour launched in 2004 on the GBA and saw a re-release on the Wii U Virtual Console in 2014. While it's not out on NSO yet, I have no doubt that it will come to the platform at some point soon. Alright, we're over halfway through this course right now. Well, technically we were over halfway in the last hole, but holes 9 and 10 were so intertwined that I just kept playing through. But now we're here at the halfway mark, I'm going to get real with you and ask you to please subscribe, because as you can see I've got a little extra with this video, and I would really appreciate it. It would help me in the great battle against the YouTube algorithm. Anyhow, as I'm getting real with you already, Nintendo was getting real with its fans back in 2005, when it adopted the Blue Ocean strategy for its games. Given that the last set of Mario Golf games were all aimed at kids and their families, that's Mario Golf Family Tour, Nintendo decided that they wanted to make their next golf game something more adult. And so Nintendo teamed up with T&E Soft to produce True Swing Golf, or in Japan, it was known as Otona no DS Golf, which it translates to Golf DS for adults. Yeah, they're not very subtle with their names. True Swing Golf was made to be a more realistic depiction of golf, with 15 different courses to play through, one of which was based on the Phoenix Country Club in Miyazaki, Japan. In terms of gameplay, it might look like your traditional golf game at first, but the second that the player is ready to swing, it moves to an overhead view of the golf ball, and the player has to use the touchscreen to pull the club back and swing it forward, the speed and angle of which affects the distance and direction of the shot. It really is an early DS game, heavily focused on pushing the touchscreen. Otherwise, it's a fairly standard golf game. It was received fairly well on release, but didn't manage to hit the heights that Mario Golf had, almost certainly due to the lack of Mario anywhere. I see why NOA was so focused on pushing Mario into all those old golf games that he wasn't actually in. The game did well enough outside of Japan, however, that in 2009 Nintendo released True Swing Golf Express as a part of their Express line of DSiWare titles. In PAL region it was called A Little Bit of Touch Golf, and that title should get across what to expect from this one. It was a version of the game that lacked many of the Wi-Fi and multiplayer features of the original, and it featured less courses in total. But interestingly, unlike many of the other Express titles Nintendo released that do feel like smaller versions of a bigger game, True Swing Golf Express actually has some improvements and new features. The game added a challenge mode to replace the championship tour of the original, and it improved the game's tutorial to make it more interactive. The DSi version of the game also ran better than the original retail release, with an improved engine and better UI. If it wasn't missing so much content, it would absolutely be the definitive version of the game. But alas, that wasn't the point of the Express line of games. True Swing Golf was intended to be Nintendo's golf game for adults, and it ended up being their worst selling golf game of all time. Which is kind of funny, because it would be followed up by a game that would appeal to more adults and be probably their best selling golf game of all time. Well, saying it's a golf game on its own is not quite right. This is more of a collection of various sports games, with golf just being a major part of it. It's time to talk about Wii Sports. This iconic collection of sports games is one of those packages that has gone down in gaming history. It doesn't feel like I'm overstating when I say that everyone has played Wii Sports, and golf was one of the 5 games included. It's an obvious fit for this package. The Wii Remote is club-shaped, kinda, and the motion of a golf swing is easily replicable using it. And the simplicity of golf compared to the likes of tennis and baseball meant that the golf part of Wii Sports felt like one of the most complete sports in the package. Too bad it only had a 9-hole course. Yeah, Wii Sports Golf only has 9 holes that are split into 3 courses of 3 holes, each with varying difficulty. Given that even the NES games managed to get 18 holes on them, it's rather baffling that Wii Sports couldn't manage this. Speaking of that NES game, all the courses in Wii Sports are actually remakes of the courses from that initial NES title. That is admittedly kind of cool, but there's no technical reason that it couldn't have 18 holes. Rather ironically, reviews at the time said that golf was the game that felt like it had the most content packed into it. That really goes to show how small of a game Wii Sports was. But I suppose it was a pack-in series of tech demos, so I can't be too harsh. Well, at least outside of Japan it was this. Poor Japan, you had to pay for this game separately. Honestly, the history of Wii Sports is too big to include in this video, but there is one development detail that's somewhat relevant. Originally, the game was going to have Mario characters in the role, meaning this could have been a Mario Golf game instead. Well, it would probably be counted as its own spin-off series, as is the case with Mario Sports Superstars, but we'll get to that in a few more courses from now. The last thing to say is that in 2013, Wii Sports received a remake on the Wii U called Wii Sports Club. This version of the game added online play to all the games and took advantage of the Wii Motion Plus. The weird thing with Wii Sports Club is that it was initially released as a download-only title, and in waves. So while Wii Sports Club launched in Japan on October 30th, 2013, golf wouldn't be added until December 18th, 2013. At least this time around, golf actually had 18 holes, woo! At least, it did after an additional update that happened even later, which added 9 holes taken from the next game in this video. With Wii Sports being the massive success that it was only natural that Nintendo would work on developing a sequel. This was especially obvious because not all of the original Wii Sports tech demos made it into the first game. Wii Airplane was oddly absent, and so later on, Nintendo would take Wii Airplane and make it one of the 13 games as a part of Wii Sports Resort. And another one of these games would be golf. Golf was one of 2 sports from the original Wii Sports that came back for this new entry, and it now utilized the Wii Motion Plus accessory, a device that you would attach to the bottom of your Wii Remote that would give better motion fidelity when playing Wii Sports games, or any Wii game for that matter. The Wii Motion Plus fixed a lot of the control issues that players had with golf in the first Wii Sports, and just allowed for an overall better product. And this time, they actually had 18 holes! Hooray! The development of the golf portion of Wii Sports Resort is actually rather funny to learn about. See, initially the developers of Wii Sports Resort didn't want to include any of the previous sports in this new entry, and then one day Miyamoto approached the team and said, "We're including golf now." As the story goes, Miyamoto was abroad giving interviews with the press about the upcoming Wii Sports Resort, and in one of those interviews he talked about how the Wii Motion Plus would allow the backswing of a player to affect how a golf shot would go, kind of like in real life. But after that interview he was informed by a colleague that golf wasn't actually a part of Wii Sports Resort. Miyamoto had just assumed it was and made this whole thing up. So in an attempt to save face, when he flew back to Japan he approached the team and forced them to add golf to it. It was a very last minute addition, and is one of the reasons why, in-game, the golfing sport is the only one to take place on a completely separate island, appropriately named Wedge Island. Kudos on the team for getting that done, and even managing to have more content than what the original game provided. You can take a break from golf. For now. So even though Nintendo had technically released 2 golf games for the Wii, Nintendo's producer Toshiharu Izuno noticed that they hadn't released a dedicated golfing game for the Wii, and wanted to fix that. And so they reached out to their good friends over at Camelot to ask about making a new Mario Golf game for Nintendo's Wii. Even though there was no Mario Golf game for the Wii, Camelot had actually released their own golf title called We Love Golf. That, for all intent and purpose, is a sequel to Mario Golf Toadstool Tour, it just lacks Mario and friends. Nintendo saw this and they wanted to make a dedicated Mario golfing game, one that would take full advantage of everything that the Wii could offer. That was until Izuno got shown the Nintendo 3DS, and then he was like, forget motion controls, that stuff's old hack, stereoscopic 3D is where it's at. And thus, Mario Golf World Tour began development. Mario Golf World Tour was the first Mario Golf game in a decade, and the team at Camelot were very aware of this. Initially, the Takahashi brothers weren't even bothered about which system the game was on. The way they saw it, technology had advanced far enough by this point that even the 3DS felt like a more powerful piece of hardware than the GameCube was, and so whatever game they made, it was going to end up feeling different from previous entries. They didn't view World Tour as being a sequel to Mario Golf Advance Tour, they viewed it as the start of something new. And it's because of this that World Tour began development as a party game and not as a role-playing golf game like the prior handhelds had been. This was actually seen as a benefit from the perspective of the team. Even though Mario Tennis Open would launch first, this was the first game they were making for the 3DS, and so they would need more development time to put towards researching and experimenting with the hardware. To make the game an RPG, they would need to write a scenario and come up with a script and characters, all aspects of development that would take too much time. So instead, they decided to make it a party game, more in line with the previous console entries. This mentality unfortunately backfired for them. See, the handheld Mario sports games from Camelot had all been RPGs, at least the ones released internationally, and so there was an expectation that this one would follow suit. During an overseas interview for Mario Tennis Open, Takahashi Shugo was asked to sign a copy of Mario Golf Advance Tour that the journalist had brought with him. During this off-the-record exchange, Shugo decided to ask the journalist what they liked about Mario Golf. At the time, they were developing World Tour, but it had yet to be announced, so he likely saw this as a good way to get feedback. And to his surprise, everyone he asked told him it was the RPG mode, with one journalist going as far as to say that playing the RPG mode from Mario Golf is what got him into golf in the first place. Uh-oh, Shugo thought. What will all these fans think if Mario Golf World Tour launches without any kind of RPG elements? This fear was then founded when Mario Tennis Open launched and reviewers critiqued the game for not including any RPG elements, and it ultimately ended up as the worst reviewed entry in the series. At that point anyway. Thus, Camelot and Nintendo began discussions over implementing an RPG mode into the game, and Nintendo was all for the idea. They saw this as a fun way of teaching new players how to play the game, like a big tutorial, and so decided to delay the game an entire 9 months to give Camelot time to add an RPG mode to the game, and this mode was called Castle Club. Due to how last minute this mode was, many of the prior RPG features had to be replaced. There were no original characters, Camelot instead used Mii's and had the player compete solely against Mario characters. There was also no experience system and instead relied on players gaining new equipment to improve. And the game's scenario was very simple, putting an emphasis on the Mario cast and showing a new side to them as opposed to any kind of major story. There were other benefits that the Castle Club brought with it. Street Pass wasn't originally in the game at all, but in the Castle Club mode they had other players' game data appear for players to look at. The Castle Club was also intended to act like an actual real-life clubhouse, and Camelot took inspiration from mobile golf for this. The clubhouse in that game served as a lobby for online tournaments, and the same thing happened in World Tour. It helped to add context to what was one of the most important aspects of that game. By far, the biggest change in technology since the previous Mario Golf game was the introduction and normalization of online play. And Camelot had already made an online golf game with mobile golf back on the Game Boy Color, so it was a natural addition to World Tour, and a big focus for the team. Through online play, Camelot could hold golfing tournaments and distribute new content to players, some of it free just like with mobile golf, and some of it paid, a first for Nintendo golf games. Mario Golf World Tour came out in the era where Nintendo was just getting into paid DLC, and World Tour was a perfect candidate for this. The game ended up releasing several DLC packs and even a season pass which provided new characters and returning courses from Mario Golf 64, remade with new graphics and fresh themes that were all mostly inspired by New Super Mario Bros. U. Speaking of courses, Mario Golf World Tour has the most to date of any Mario Golf game, with a whopping 16 courses. These courses were split into 3 categories: DLC courses, club courses, and Mario courses. DLC courses are all returning courses, as established a moment ago. Club courses were intended to be more traditional golf courses for players who just wanted to play golf. And then Mario courses were the gimmick courses, the stages with hazards on, and Mario craziness abound. By making this distinction, the team felt like they had made a Mario Golf game that appeals to all players. Castle Club could act as a mode for those looking to become pro golf players, while the Mario Golf section of the game was for players who wanted the more party-like atmosphere. This also allowed the team to make the Mario courses even more outlandish than in previous games, both gimmick-wise and visual-wise. As a sign of this, the first course designed for the game was Cheep Cheep Lagoon, a golf course that's entirely underwater. Mario Golf World Tour was very well received by critics, but it was also criticised for not being ambitious enough. It certainly was Mario Golf, but given it had been 10 years since the last entry, for many players the jump in gameplay didn't feel that grand. It was a solid game with a great amount of content, but nothing that shook up the formula already established. Fans wanted to see something new from the next entry, and as I type this, I can hear the finger of the monkey's paw curl up.
Alright, we're nearing the final stretch of this Nintendo History Golf, and for the next 2 entries, we have a couple of lovely par 3s, as this time around, golf is included not as its own standalone thing, but as part of a bigger release. And for this first one, we're looking back at Mario, as we have a collection of Mario sports games released for the 3DS in 2017. Yes, this is Mario Sports Superstars, a game that came with 5 different sports. Golf was one of them. It was a cross-developed game between Nintendo, Bandai Namco, Camelot and Hexadrive, with Camelot handling the golf and tennis portions of the game. And Mario Sports Superstars is certainly a game that exists.
This game was primarily made by Bandai Namco, with Camelot being brought in to basically just add the already existing tennis and golf engines from their last 2 Mario sports games into this package, with some completely uninspired golf courses thrown in for good measure. And that's really it with this one. Mario Sports Superstars isn't a bad game, but it is a very by-the-books title. If critics thought that World Tour, the game that went all out with its Mario levels and theming, was too unambitious, then Superstars was inevitably going to come off as a snooze fest.
The most interesting thing I can say about this one is that it gave us Mario Golf amiibo cards, and part of me thinks that this game only really exists so that they could release these amiibo cards. At least the uninspired courses of this game were actually new courses. Alright, so for this next game, we have something slightly different. Now obviously the whole video here is themed around the idea that Nintendo has released 18 different golf games. But in reality, golf has appeared in plenty more of their titles. Rhythm Heaven on the Wii, Wario Land 3, Mario and Sonic at the Rio 2016 games, Mario and Sonic at the Rio 2016 games, and Mario Party all have golfing themed minigames as a part of them. And I didn't really want to include them because they're just very simple minigames. I'm bringing all this up now because the next game is not a dedicated sports game, and it's not a dedicated golf game. It is instead a collection of a lot of little games, and golf is one of them. This is when golf became one of the 51 worldwide classics in Clubhouse games. Developed by Endcube, 51 Worldwide Classics, Clubhouse Games, is mostly made up of traditional tabletop and card games, but this Switch sequel has a few other additional games that weren't in the original DS entry, and one of those is golf. I chose to put a special emphasis on this one, making it one of my 18 courses, because even though it's just one of 51 different games, it feels like an intentional callback to Nintendo's golfing origins. The game is played from a top-down perspective and is very similar to the original golf found on NES. In fact, it's a little bit too similar. Wait a minute. These are the same courses. Yep, Clubhouse Games Golf has pulled a Wii Sports and actually remade all of the courses from the original golf on NES that started all of this off. I would say we've come full circle, but we still have 2 more holes to play through. Here we are at the penultimate hole and the final entry in the Mario Golf line of games. This is the latest golfing game made by Camelot, and in many ways, it innovated the series and met all of the requests that fans wanted from World Tour. And in many other ways, it was seen as the worst entry in the series and was vehemently hated online by the public. And I think that's a little unfair. I do agree that it's not the best Mario Golf game out there, but my issue is more so with the way everyone looks at it. People complain that it lacked a lot of content at launch and that the RPG mode is kind of lackluster, while they're praising all of the new mechanics. But in my opinion, I think it launched with a perfectly reasonable amount of content, especially compared to Mario Tennis Aces, and the RPG mode was far more involved than it was in World Tour. No, my problem is with the titular new mechanic of the game, the Super Rush. To explain the development of Mario Golf Super Rush, we have to look all the way back to Mario Golf on the 64. One part of that game's development that I failed to mention is that the Takahashi brothers had at one point tried to make it so every hole in a course could be seen in one map, like a real golf course. But due to technical limitations of the hardware, this was just not possible, and so the idea was scrapped. But now, over 2 decades later, the technology is here, and Camelot could design golf courses that felt realistic, and wanted to take advantage of this fact in the gameplay. At the same time, critics of World Tour had complained that it was too similar to the previous Mario Golf titles, and so Camelot wanted to really shake up the formula for this new entry. Thus, they came up with Speed Golf, a mode where all players played golf at the same time, and the objective was to get into the hole as quickly as possible. In addition to typical golf rules, this mode alleviated other complaints players had about golf in general, especially complaints levied against the online modes of Wii Sports Club and Mario Golf World Tour. The turn-based nature of golf made online play against real opponents slow and boring. So Speed Golf became the focus, and the Super Rush was added as a new mechanic to the game that allowed players to get across the map faster. And to be honest, based on the reviews of this game, many players really enjoyed this change up to the formula. In fact, most reviews criticise the lack of launch content and length of the story mode, and praise everything else. But I'm actually of the opposite opinion. I think the Speed Golf, while neat, had a major knock-on effect to how Super Rush was designed that made it feel weaker than past entries, and that is in the course design. Because Speed Golf asked players to run across the map themselves and move from course to course directly, it meant that all the courses had to be compact and conservative in their design. This gameplay mechanic meant that the more interesting and wacky Mario courses found in Toadstool Tour and World Tour couldn't be included here, and it left the game feeling kind of bland as a result. I also don't like many of the changes made to the UI and general golf gameplay of the previous games that were added either to accommodate Speed Golf or just to change things up. To me, these are all worse than in previous entries, and it left me disappointed. Mario Golf Super Rush isn't a bad game, and similar to Mario Tennis Aces, by the time all of its updates were out, the game was pretty hefty content-wise. It had new modes, it had more characters than any other prior entry, and while it didn't have as many courses as World Tour, at least they were all new courses. It just had a rough launch and new gameplay mechanics that, while doing something different, strayed too far from what made the older games fun, in my opinion.
And finally, we're here at Hole 18. This is the latest golf game from Nintendo, and probably its most disappointing. Now, to be fair, Nintendo Switch Sports isn't that bad of a game. It's just got a lot of the problems that people levied against Mario Golf Super Rush when it came out. Just a lack of content to justify the price, and just not much to do in the game in general. And bizarrely, even though golf is one of the few sports games that appeared in every single Wii Sports title, it was delayed here. Nintendo Switch Sports launched without golf and added it in an update later on. And this update came about 6 months after launch, just for golf. Now, there's not really a lot to say about Nintendo Switch Sports, golf specifically, because there's not much different about it compared to the last two. Nintendo Switch Sports Golf pretty much just took what Wii Sports and Wii Sports Resort Golf had done and just did it again. It even used the exact same courses, but didn't bring back the Wii Sports Club courses. In fact, it came up with 3 new courses to replace them, and that's kind of it. If you play it offline, it was just the same game, but now you had sports mates instead of Miis. Whereas if you play it online, you've at least got one new mode, which was Survival Golf. Survival Golf was a game where you and 4 other players, 8 players in total, played against each other, and whoever's got the highest score dropped out of each round, and you went for 5 holes. And that's it, that's the only new thing they added. It's really disappointing given that we had to wait for so long to get it. So yeah, a bit of a downer for the final entry in Nintendo's golf history. So you know what, let's just move on to the conclusion. Let's wrap up this game. And that does it for the 18 holes of Nintendo Golf. I really wanted to get this video out now because at this moment in time there are 18 significant instances of golf from Nintendo that I can talk about, and it won't remain that way. I know the last 2 holes were a bit of a downer, but despite that I have hope for the future of Nintendo Golf, more so on the Camelot side. There will no doubt be a Nintendo Switch Sports 2, but whether it has golf or not remains to be seen. But a new Mario Golf is all but guaranteed. Camelot have gone on the record to say that they enjoy making the Mario sports games because they're the best selling games Camelot has ever made. And despite complaints about Super Rush, it is the second best selling Mario Golf game ever. Honestly, learning about why we didn't get a Mario Golf from Camelot on the Wii and DS tells me that we won't see a situation like that again. It was just a fluke of the time. And based on the team's response to fans during and after the development of Mario Golf World Tour, I'm confident that Camelot will listen for the next game, and we may even see them retire the Miis to bring back original human characters again, similar to how Nintendo Switch Sports abandoned them. Only time will tell. Anyway, This was the Nintendo Chronicler, that was my golf game, and I scored nothing but holes in one. You can't prove that I didn't.
Couldn't quite follow the ball.
Don't follow that, I missed.